One cannot discuss South Africa without talking about apartheid, the system that governed it for most of its history. From independence until the early 90s, this system of racial segregation impacted almost every facet of society. South Africa's non-white population was kept in check by a series of laws that gave them almost no real political power. This video isn't about the history of apartheid, but a breakdown of how it worked in practice and the laws that kept it in place. For context, let's go over the racial makeup of apartheid-era South Africa. At birth, the South African government issued documents telling people what race they were. The passage of the Population Registration Act in 1950 divided people into 4 categories: white, colored, Asian, and black. Whites had the highest status and standard of living in South African society. They controlled the government, businesses, and religious organizations in the country. Around 2/3 of whites were Afrikaners, descendants of Dutch settlers from the 18th century. They also spoke Afrikaans, a language very similar to Dutch. The rest were English-speaking descendants from the British Isles. Coloreds were a tier below the whites. Most of them had worked for whites for generations as either servants or employees. Coloreds were kind of a mix of all the ethnic groups in South Africa, having a very diverse background. They wanted whites to treat them as equals, but obviously this didn't happen. Generally, for coloreds, the lighter your skin, the better your status. Asians were the 3rd tier. They were descendants of Indians who came from the British Raj to work under contract on sugar plantations. Most Asians continue to practice Hinduism and still followed the caste system, essentially creating an apartheid within apartheid. Blacks were the majority of the population. They had migrated to South Africa from the north around 1000 CE. They were the lowest tier in South African society and basically just did all the shitty jobs no one else wanted to do. All blacks in South Africa were technically citizens of their homelands, but we'll get into that later. While South Africa had governmental systems for other racial groups, the white government was the only one that held any real power. South Africa had a parliament with 165 members, a prime minister, and a state president, although the position of state president was pretty much symbolic. Only white citizens 18 or older could vote in parliamentary elections. The white government was dominated by the Afrikaner-led National Party for the entirety of the apartheid era. The Asians had an entity called the South African Indian Council. It allowed them to make policies for certain services, such as education, for the Asian community. The coloreds had a similar council, but they voted to abolish it, claiming it had no real power. As I mentioned earlier, the South African government considered blacks to be citizens of their homelands. Homelands were the South African equivalent of American Indian reservations. Each tribe was assigned to a separate homeland. It also just so happened that the homelands were situated on the worst farmland in the country. The South African government treated them as separate nations, claiming to give them increased autonomy, eventually leading to full independence. In reality, these homelands had no real power and only existed to give the appearance to the outside world that the apartheid government was democratic. Education in South Africa was pretty poor across the board, but it was especially bad for non-white students. White children aged 7 to 16 had to go to school, most of which attended public school. Only about half of white students actually completed high school. Just like white children, colored and Asian children were required to go to school. However, they often faced a shortage of classrooms. Only about 10% of colored children and 25% of Asian children even made it to high school. Blacks in South Africa, much like basically every other area, were treated the worst in education. The passage of the Bantu Education Act in 1953 legally enforced segregation in educational institutions. Until 1981, the South African government didn't even require black children to attend school. Even with this law, only about 20% of black children went to school at all due to the lack of resources from the South African government. The apartheid government deliberately kept blacks poorly educated to ensure they only held low-paying menial jobs. South African Education Minister Hendrik Verwoerd once said, "There is no place for the Bantu in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor. What is the use of teaching the Bantu child mathematics when it cannot use it in practice?" While higher education was available, it was extremely limited to non-white students. South Africa had 11 white universities compared to only 3 black universities and 1 each for coloreds and Asians. As a result, attendance was also significantly higher among whites. The limited availability of higher education for non-white students combined with other laws that were in place made upward mobility extremely difficult for the non-white population. South Africa is a nation that is very rich in natural resources. It has the world's largest supply of gold and diamonds. Due to international sanctions as a result of apartheid, South Africa produced almost all its goods domestically. However, the labor force was strictly divided among racial lines designed by the government. The labor market remained segregated through the job reservation system. As the name implies, certain jobs were reserved for certain races. This basically ensured that all the high-paying, skilled labor was only available to whites, while non-whites were left with the low-paying, unskilled labor. Job reservation laws also led to a shortage of skilled labor, which provoked efforts to ease the laws by the early 80s. Due to the fact that black homelands were completely neglected by the government, it was pretty much impossible for blacks to find work within their homelands. As a result, most were forced to leave their families behind to find work in gold mines or on farms long distances from home, although companies were given financial incentives to put factories closer to homelands. White citizens were required to serve in the South African Defense Force, the nation's armed forces. The army was used for internal suppression of the resistance to apartheid and the countless active conflicts the country was involved in under the apartheid government, such as the South African Border War and Portuguese Colonial War. The media in South Africa was very tightly controlled under the apartheid government. All radio and television stations were state-owned, and the Publications Control Board would review all plays, books, etc. to determine if it could be seen by the South African public. If the board felt that a work was obscene or touched too much on racial issues, it would not be allowed. As a result, countless works were banned, and many artists were not allowed to publish within their own country. South Africa was subject to an international sports boycott as a result of apartheid. Until the early 90s, the IOC, the ICC, the IRB, FIFA, and many other international sports organizations had banned South Africa. This resulted in a generation of athletes who had never performed outside of domestic leagues. The impact of this boycott on South Africa's international performance is mixed. While South Africa has performed poorly in the FIFA World Cup, they have done okay in the Cricket World Cup and have won 2 Rugby World Cups since the end of apartheid. The system of apartheid has had far-reaching impacts on South African society. The consequences are still being felt almost 25 years later as black South Africans remain uneducated as a result of deliberate government action under apartheid. Regardless of your opinion on apartheid, the fact remains that the system simply wasn't sustainable. You simply can't have a system where 16% of the population lives comfortably at the expense of 84% of the population and expect that system to last forever. Such a system is almost destined to face deep resentment and instability.